Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Piper. I serve as Executive Director of the Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council, and we are so thankful to have you all joining us today for this Zoom webinar about using solar as an economic development tool. The mission of the Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council is to champion advanced energy as an economic development and job creation strategy. Our definition of advanced energy is technology neutral. So anything that makes energy cleaner, safer, more secure, more efficient is in the tent, and it includes electricity and transportation. We decided to host this Zoom webinar today because we've been getting a lot of feedback across the state about access to solar energy in particular, but renewable energy. We've seen an increase in the state of solar being used as an economic development tool. Companies are now wanting access to this resource and they're using it in their economic development negotiations. So we thought it would be a great idea to host this webinar and get some questions answered and have an open forum for you all today. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is Kim Raia. She is an environmental management consultant at the University of Tennessee County Technical Assistance Service. Kim, take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. As Courtney said, I'm Kim Raia. I work with County Technical Assistance Service. We are part of the Institute for Public Service, which is part of the University of Tennessee. I have been working with CTAS for about approaching 25 years now. And as my title infers, I am the environmental consultant for local governments, counties in particular. A big part of my job is to help communities with waste management and land use. So obviously the expansion of solar is on our radar. It's not that solar panels from the waste standpoint are unmanageable, but it is an expanding waste stream. So we are watching this. We're also interested in how we can best encourage solar development while advising local governments on how to best monitor and regulate and fit the needs of their communities. The Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council has put together an esteemed panel of experts in the solar industry, government, and conservation, and they are here now today to present information on this emerging and important topic. So I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. Won't do a long bio here, but Gina Brown, Director, Economic and Community Development, Silicon Ranch Corporation. Welcome.
Thank you.
Lindsay Hanna, Director of Government Relations and Climate Policy, the Nature Conservancy. Hello. Craig Fitzhugh, Mayor, City of Ripley. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you.
Terry Wimberley, President and CEO, Paris Board of Public Utilities.
Hello, thank you.
And Kyle Spurgeon, President and CEO, Greater Jackson Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Kim.
All right, and Madison Haynes, Associate of Bradley, Erant, Bolt, and Cummings. So I think that's our panel. And with that, we're going to jump right in because we've got a full packed agenda. I'm going to ask the first question to Kyle Spurgeon. And if you would, Kyle, please describe the current role that that solar energy has in the economic development process.
Yeah, thank you. Great question, Kim. Appreciate being asked to be a part of this panel. Yeah, maybe first of all, just to level set a bit, because looking at the folks on this call, I know there are people that are on the call that have cited a project or been around it and know exactly how the economic development process works. Others may have been around it a bit, and others have no clue what economic developers do other than we show up and make an announcement every now and then. And but the background on that, just some 101 stuff. Communities like us, we receive our projects in Tennessee, from the state of Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, in partnership typically with TVA, with their economic development team, or directly from a consultant, or a combination of all of those. Now, when you start working a project, I'll just use a recent example. In December, we announced a Georgia Pacific project here, over a $450 million project, 220 jobs. That project started with a 1,200 question RFI, or request for information. So just imagine completing 1,200 questions. And what that does, and in our business, it's called site selection, but really we prefer to call it site elimination. Because when a consultant is looking at a community, big projects, they're looking at dozens and in some cases hundreds of communities across the country to cite the new investment. And what they want to do is quickly eliminate as many communities as possible so that they can concentrate on for their client, for those projects or those communities that would work best. Regards to solar, if you're not able to answer the question, how can you help us as a community reach our renewable energy goals? If you cannot check that box, you're going to get eliminated. And in many cases, if your community's got a reputation for not being friendly to renewable energy, you're never going to know that you were eliminated on that project. So it plays a huge role, even bigger than most people think about, because those consultants must be able to answer that question for their client. And if you cannot say, yes, we will partner with you, we have relationships with providers in the region that can help you meet your renewable energy goals, if your answer is no, you're not going to move on to phase 2 of that project.
Very good. I guess this might compare to where we were with broadband maybe a decade ago or so. Is it a similar path?
Yeah, and in our case, it was 2 decades ago here in Jackson. And we think about it as a toolbox. You've got a toolbox of economic development tools. Early in broadband and fiber connectivity across the country, Jackson was a community that 20 years ago, we could check that box. And a lot of other communities still cannot do that. So yeah, I equate this exactly the way fiber was a decade ago, 20 years ago. If you cannot answer the question that we can help you with your renewable energy goals, just like if you cannot tell a company we've got fiber connectivity here in our community, you're going to be eliminated. I mean, it's that simple.
Thank you. So Gina, a question for you with regards to economic development. What is the typical process for a project that has an economic impact or economic development component and solar energy as part of the component or as part of the package?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So our company, Silicon Ranch, was founded with economic development being at its core. One of our founders is the former Commissioner of Economic Development for the state of Tennessee. So they saw that this was a tool, which Kyle mentioned earlier, the toolbox. It's such a great way to put it. And from a community's benefit, the obvious benefits from a project are substantial capital investment, which every economic developer out there knows it's about capital investment and jobs. And while solar facilities, solar farms do create jobs in the construction phase, there may not be the long-term jobs that some communities are thinking around with that. But when it comes to the investment and the accretive increase to the tax base for communities, it can be quite substantial. And that money goes back into the city or county coffers. We are a very low user of county or city services, meaning we're not high water users, sewer users, or even on the roads past the construction phase. So those are the obvious benefits that come from a solar farm or solar facility locating in a community from the economic development side. But I think there's also something to be said for understanding from the developer side, the community that you're in and what the needs are of that community. And one example of that I have is a project that we had in Bedford County, Tennessee. And it was a TVA project. And in conversations with the economic developer, Shane Hooper, we knew that they wanted to expand the footprint of their industrial park. And we had some excess land that we already had land under option, excuse me. So we had some land that we could look to either, we thought about selling it to them, we thought about donating, and in the end, we donated land that increased the size of their industrial park, which we are right on the edge of. And they were able to recruit one of their largest manufacturers in some time. And so I think it is that that chain that continues that thread, because again, we want to be able to understand what the community needs as well.
That sounds like a great project in Bedford County there. So the industrial footprint actually was expanded as a result of your work with the industrial board.
And
now
they were
have the
able,
solar. Uh-huh.
and as Kyle mentioned earlier, you know, the projects that come from the state or TVA or through a consultant, that was one of those projects that put Bedford County on the short list.
Okay. Thank you for that. Terry Wimberley, in terms of the utilities, what is the role that you all play in terms of siting and locating solar energy projects?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. You know, we see our role is very vital in, first of all, if solar is going to generate power, that has to connect with a grid somewhere. So if it's going to locate and interconnect with our grid, then it matters where it locates, right? We have to have some infrastructure to get that power into the grid or back where it needs to go. You know, we've got some very rural places in Henry County, Tennessee with single phase lines, and maybe there's a landowner who would be willing to sell out there, but there's not enough infrastructure there to get the electricity back where it needs to be. So there's a lot of guidance and collaboration with the local utility to actually site those locations into a place that's going to be advantageous for the grid itself. I will say also, just kind of a little bit different angle than that, the local advisement of my staff, my people in our community to actually have conversations with landowners about possible projects, because so we've cited 2 projects here in Henry County. Both times we had a local staff person sort of trailblazing those conversations with the landowner. You know, in small Henry County, Paris, Tennessee, we all know each other, and we know those landowners, we know those farmer families, and they know us. And so we can go out and have a conversation early on, whereas a solar developer from, you know, somewhere in Tennessee or some other state might show up on their property, knock on the door, and not be met with, you know, a very welcome response. But if we are the one having the initial conversation and can talk about, hey, you know what, there's advantage for you as a landowner. But there's also an advantage for our community for this project happening here, that if we can buy power cheaper than we were buying it from TVA, then our customers win. There's a lot of wins, and we start talking to that landowner about, hey, this is a project that can be bigger than just yourself. You can make a difference for a utility and for your own community by getting involved and listening to the possibilities of siting solar on that property. And so we see our local involvement is very important, just maybe to help find some willing sellers. The 2 projects I talked about, our staff, we sited an 80-acre spot within 2 days. We also were very instrumental in putting together almost 600 acres that involved 10 different property owners that were contiguous to that 600 acres. And we think there is no way that any solar developer could have come in and done that without the local help there. So that's been our role, and we think it's pretty pivotal.
That sounds pretty critical. And it sounds like there's an indirect benefit here and a direct benefit to the community, not just the landowner through this process.
Yeah, so Kyle mentioned, you know, we want to be that community that has that tool in our toolbox. And if we can be of assistance to help site solar here, then our economic development folks can sell that, right, Kyle, and sell that to those prospective industries who want to be looking at Henry County, Tennessee. And so that's important to us to help be a part of leading that. And also to have, you know, the RECs available to my local industries. We actually have, we have a deal with one of my local industries where they're going to get RECs off of a solar project that is connected to the grid that they're connected to. And they see that as very valuable, and they can market that and they can sell that. And so that's another valuable piece is to be able to recruit those industries and talk about those RECs.
Does this at times does it conflict with land use restrictions or long range planning, or do you work with, how does it buffer with the local government regulations?
So the county of Henry has no ordinances about land use in the county. That might be a little bit different story in the city, but with no ordinance restrictions in the county. And so far, all of our sightings have been in the county footprint.
Okay. All right, so thank you for that. We're going to ask a couple of questions of Lindsay Hanna now. Lindsay with the Nature Conservancy is also interested in locating renewable energy projects, but also avoiding impacts on sensitive natural and working lands. The question I have for you is, what are some best practices that you can share, especially with respect to the siting, construction, and operation of these projects?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. And I appreciate being here today with you all and having the conservation-based perspective, which I think is a little bit different. For those on the webinar who aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we are the largest environmental conservation organization worldwide, and we have chapters in all 50 states and in 78 countries. And I'm here in Tennessee, and I work closely with my colleagues at our North America Renewable Energy team. And I think what's interesting about the Nature Conservancy is that we have very lofty goals to both conserve wildlife habitats and natural areas, but also to develop renewable energy to meet climate goals. And so with balancing those dual objectives, which might be at odds with each other, we were very curious to get down to whether or not it's possible to continue to conserve priority areas while building out renewables over the next 30 years. And so my colleagues at the North America level, they just recently did a study called Power of Place, which sought to answer this question in terms of what is going to be the impact on land if we can meet clean energy infrastructure goals to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And so the study determined that there is obviously going to be a significant amount of land required to meet these goals. And that was estimated at nationally 250,000 square miles if it's business as usual, but that it is possible to achieve a 70% reduction in land use needs, avoiding impacts to over 115,000 square miles. So that's pretty significant land differentiation if we were to continue business as usual versus put into effect some of the best practices that the Nature Conservancy has identified. So right now, I'm working with stakeholders here in Tennessee to figure out how we can map some of those nationwide recommendations to our state here. Some of the recommendations won't apply. It was pretty heavy on options like co-location of wind and solar, and wind for a variety of reasons isn't very viable here in Tennessee. And so leaning more heavily on the solar deployment, there are multiple recommendations that the organization has come up with. And so part of that is, I know Silicon Ranch, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but agrivoltaics in terms of co-siting both the protection of crops or the protection of livestock with solar panels. And I'm sure Gina wants to talk more about that later, because I know you have great examples of that in practice. But in addition to that, different approaches for which sort of PV panel to choose, whether or not it's a fixed tilt or single axis, really impacts how much land is used. But then beyond that, also looking at long-term energy planning that really incorporates environmental and social data to site in low impact areas. And the Nature Conservancy is a very data-driven organization. We have a lot of data around this. We've worked with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency on the most recent state wildlife action planning process to map areas of critical conservation and to identify those and compare that for solar siting is one approach where we can minimize impacts. And so those are publicly available maps. I have colleagues in other areas around the Midwest that have taken data such as that and are working directly with utilities and policymakers to provide that as a tool for siting. And in addition to that, there's other best practices that can be done, including having incentives at the policy level for siting that have lower environmental, social, and economic risk, as well as best practices for, you mentioned, Kim, a question about the actual construction of facilities. Once you get to past siting to actual construction, having principles and practices around what happens on that actual site. So in terms of biodiversity and planting species that are going to help pollinators, in terms of how you're managing land so that it's not fragmented with fences that keep wildlife out. So really having principles and practices that are around maintaining connected corridors so that if you are in an area that's going to have wildlife moving through it, you're not putting up fences that are going to prevent that wildlife from moving through. So a variety of different design practices as well that will help with vegetation buffers and helping with stream and wetland and water quality as well. So those are a few of the best practices that I could share.
Okay, thank you for that. I think one thing that it keeps coming up in our communities without zoning is like, is there a broad brush way to, with the siting portion of this, how do you decide which areas are the most suited to solar that are not with respect to the ROI, but with respect to preserving your resources in your community. And I think that comes up quite a bit. And we know that we've, on the construction part of it, there's elements of the stormwater and construction permits that would maybe come into play. But once you get past that, the location of these rather large facilities are not necessarily regulated at the local level the way that some would maybe want them to be. So that's a broad brush way of looking at that. So duration of the utility as well, that's another thing. You've got a long period of time that utility is in play with that particular land use. So just things to consider on the issue of impact. But we're going to move on to Mayor Fitzhugh. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
We know that you're considering solar and that you have a sense of what some of the benefits are that these might bring to your community. Wondering if you could share your insight into the process that you're going through to make this decision, and if there are any words of wisdom or special considerations that you would ask or you would want other local officials to consider as they're going down this road.
Well, I appreciate you using the word wisdom with me. That's because I'm the oldest one here, but I do appreciate that. Our each of the participants have given tremendous benefits that we expect to take advantage of for sure. We were lucky in that we've got a small solar project now that's worked out really well. No problems, no difficulties. The prior administration and before have made some changes in our regulations or in our charters and things like that, type of community laws. And we looked at those now. We've had an opportunity for a fairly large solar facility that's coming in, and it's the process is one where you look at your regulatory deal, you look at your zoning, you look at the location. We are generally a rural community, so we want to, keep the rural effect. You have to look at setbacks and all that type of thing that you do with other industries. But there's it's a different type of setting, and we just need to make ourselves aware of that. We know some other communities have been a little, leery of what does solar mean? What does it do? We're talking to our community about that, and it's been received very, very positively. I tell you, the other thing is, as Kyle mentioned, it's sort of a exclusionary type process. If you don't have it, you're gonna not make the cut. And over where we are, we're fortunate to be only like 30 miles away from the Blue Oval project that Ford's putting on. It's making a tremendous change already in our community, and we're lucky to have that going with the solar. Ours is located very near our industrial park, and one of our industrial parks, and it's on where folks would come from out of town into town, and we think that's a positive. It gives us at least the impression, and I think we are, of a progressive city that's ready to move forward on things like that. So I've been very, very happy with the way things are going for us. It adds to our what we believe to be a good source for growth. for not just folks that will actually use the grid or as for industrial purposes, but folks that may want to move in here because there's going to have to be an increase of the population in West Tennessee. And maybe they'll recognize that this may be a good small town to raise their family because of things as innovative as solar's become and as important as it is as well.
That's a good answer. It sounds like you're also advocating for consistency and transparency in the regulatory process here too, to make sure that the community knows what they're getting and that you grade everybody fairly in terms of the entities that are approaching you.
Yeah, you're right. Transparency is the key to that, and non-complicated as well. It goes right with transparency, because if people know what they've got to do and know what it is, then you got no problems. It's only when you haven't explained those type of things that you may run into problems down the road when it's too late to change opinions. So yes, you're exactly right about that.
Thank you for that. Okay, we'll move back to Kyle Spurgeon here. And I guess this is a question again back to land use and how can we preserve the highest and the best land use for the communities that are considering solar development? And are there special considerations in rural or unincorporated areas?
Thank you, Kim. I think you just gave me the easiest question to answer, but in some cases, unfortunately, in some communities, it may be pretty hard to execute, but it's all about communication and partnerships. And I'll use both Terry and Mayor Fitzhugh as an example of, they've got industrial parks. A fail would be that if they worked with a solar company to go in and they took 50 acres inside an industrial park to put up a solar array that could have gone somewhere else in the community. Because when you do that, you take 50 acres offline and you're not going to be able to recruit a company to that site that might actually want to use your renewable energy resources. So you've got to make sure you're following your community plan. Most communities do and should have a master plan for land use. And then, equally as important with that, you need to be working with a solar company that asks you that very question. We've had over the last 5 to 6 years, companies call us, hey, we would love to look at property inside your industrial park. We've got some solar opportunities that we see Jackson is a good fit for. Those conversations go nowhere because we're not about to use that property that we've invested tens of millions of dollars in, not only site acquisition, but infrastructure improvements out there. We've had great success partnering with Silicon Ranch because they asked that question. It's like, yeah, we don't want to go inside an industrial park, but just like what Craig mentioned, we want to be close. And so that's what we help facilitate. So it's all about partnerships and communication and making sure that you're working with a company that understands economic development and that your team locally is abiding by your land use plans and maximizing the future of your industrial parks.
I like that. And I guess how would you envision the use of brownfields in this exercise?
I like a great resource. I mean, great opportunity, but it all goes into, you might have a brownfield right in the center of your city. That's probably not the best place for a solar operation, but then again, it might be. But it's looking at and working with companies that can maximize that property there. And I think we all should look at opportunities for brownfields that are nearby or close to industrial parks, because an opportunity with a solar company is probably easier to pull off on a brownfield development than you might have with a manufacturing company that may or may not want to locate on a brownfield.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. That's a good answer. I think, we're also looking at the prime agriculture, component and wanting to make sure that that's not the first choice. And I'm assuming that would be your perspective as well. Is that?
Yeah, and it goes back to communication. If you don't have a good relationship with folks that own agricultural property in your community, if you don't have good relationships with the farmers in the community, the Nature Conservancy, others that are on this call that are very structured in what they do and how they view land use, around this country, then that's another opportunity for failure, because just because as an economic developer, I look out and see 100 acres that in my mind might be a great place for a solar installation, that may not be the highest and best use because it needs to remain agriculture. So it's all about continuing to work together and communicate, and don't just take a project because someone says that 100 acres is the best. Make sure everyone on your team agrees with that decision.
Great answer. Thank you. I'm going to move to Madison Haynes and ask you a couple of questions if I could. We're looking for what some of the key policy considerations that local elected officials and planning commissioners might keep in mind when adding solar to their communities, and how they might navigate any potential challenges there.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So I think that Kyle and Craig and Gina and others have really hit on a lot of the major points when it comes to crafting your zoning policy. But, no matter the location or the size, all communities want to be known as a great place to live, as a great place to work. But they also want to be known as a great place to do business. And, one thing that's consistent among all industries is that, businesses love regulatory certainty. And local policymakers really play a huge role in this. And first off, promoting solar and the development of projects really should be viewed through the same lens as any other industrial recruitment. It's a company that's looking to locate in your community and bringing millions of dollars. As Gina mentioned, they don't always have the same jobs, but some communities that may not be what they need. They maybe have more workforce challenges than others, and they're really looking for some investment and some money to maybe get some industrial sites going, hire some teachers, fire protection, every community is different. And so that's something that there is no one size fits all policy. And I think that Craig really hit on that the way that they view their community is important. And they, the city of Ripley and Lauderdale County really are rowing all in the same direction. So that's the first thing that I think is important, not only for solar development, but just for economic development in general. So, a project comes in and a project gets cited with your local utility or with TVA directly. They've had a conversation with the people like Kyle, and then it comes time to get permitted and to go through kind of the site plan and the zoning process. And here is where many communities, if you haven't had a project locate, you may not have a solar ordinance in play and specific to solar. And so one kind of policy consideration that I recommend just from my personal view and personal working in this area is to engage in that early, and it's a lot easier to have kind of conversations. I know that I've spoken to Craig about, what other communities are doing, reaching out to stakeholders on this call, reaching out to local, there's a Tennessee Solar Industry Association that's kind of a industrial board of the Tennessee chapter of SEIA, which is a national organization, reaching out to those policymakers and those decision makers in other communities that maybe have used to be in the same spot that you are now. I think that two considerations that really every community has is Kyle really hit on the underlying zoning of where you allow your projects, and forcing them into industrial property is not always conducive. And also forcing them into ag is not always conducive. And so figuring out what your zoning map wants to look like and where you want to site these projects, because they can't be sited on every piece of property. There's infrastructure concerns that Terry knows all too well, that these properties, need to be close to the grid interconnection. And there's a lot of other factors at play. And so really looking at your resources in your community land-wise and what you have available is important. Another is setbacks. And that's one that we really spend a lot of time on when we're talking with communities, because it's really the vehicle by which we have conversations about the visual impacts of solar. And I think that that is a really dominating conversation. And I think that it's one that sometimes there can be some unintended consequences with, the larger the setback, which also means the larger reciprocal regulation you put on your adjoining properties, that just as an example. And so every company that I have worked with is all for protecting existing residential uses and screening from those property owners that are that have made investment into, you know, your communities. And so I think really talking to all those parties, industry, community, as early as possible and crafting something that works for your community really will make the people that are in roles like Kyle's, as well as Gina and Craig and really everybody on this call. Once you have those rules in place and everyone knows the rules of the road, the businesses that are coming to locate millions of dollars in your community really know how to play ball. And I think that's important. And I think that it really can contribute to the success of the projects.
Thank you. I think that hits a lot of the areas that people are buzzing our phones with as well. So thank you. We're going to ask a question that I know is on everyone's mind, and we'll open it up first to Gina, and then maybe open this up a little further. But we know there's a lot of discussion around decommissioning solar farms, or what's to be done with the panels in terms of removal once they've reached their end of life. I guess the question is, who is ultimately responsible for disposal, and what options are most practical for disposal, reuse, and recycling of solar panels?
The D word is a conversation that we have often. And I think what's so hard about decommissioning and some of the discussions, and for people to wrap their brain around, is we're talking about something decades down the line, right? It's estimated a solar farm's lifespan is about 40 years. That is if they don't choose to re-energize. So to answer your question, because I think that some misinformation came about at a very high industry level when a Los Angeles Times article came out recently. I would say it's within the last year. And there was some misinformation there, making it sound like all these panels, that there weren't enough places for them to go, right? And they're all going into landfills or just not being recycled, not being repurposed. And I think, back to your question about whose responsibility is, it's the landowner's responsibility to remove the equipment. Our business model is that we try to purchase all of our properties, and therefore we own all of our assets. It does not help us one bit not to decommission a project at its end of life. If we plan to sell, we're only in the solar business, so we would probably likely sell that land, or if it was to be continued to be energized as a solar project, obviously we would keep it. Technology is going to change over the years too, so you'll be moving panels in and out. And we have decided to partner with companies that see the focus and need to recycle and repurpose. From our solar panel manufacturer that we use, they've got a recycling program for solar based out of Ohio. And then also we have a recycling partner, Solar Cycle, who is focused completely on taking the components, repurposing for other panels if needed, or any other type of industry needs. But I think that this is where we're going to see the evolution in the industry for that back end of the house, because that is what needs to happen. That's that next part, obviously the manufacturing to keep up with the needs to develop a solar facility. But the back end there is also going to be a critical infrastructure needed that's going to continue to grow.
Thank you for that. I know I'll use my example for my own work with financial assurance and landfills, which obviously have a lot more potential for harm than solar panels. But we were kind of wondering if there should not be some sort of financial assurance agreement between the owner operator and the utility perhaps, or the landowner, and where would the local government fit into that?
Is that question for me?
Or any of y'all?
I wasn't sure who it was directed at.
I'm sorry, it was in my head. It wasn't.
No. We have been in communities before where there is some sort of financial assurance required because it is part of something that they have. There are states that have limited that, Tennessee being one. We do see the need, though, to provide our communities that we're in with a decommissioning plan, which at this point in the project, what we know is going to happen, what we know needs to be removed. We take great pride, as Lindsay alluded to earlier, in our land management practice and our regenerative energy program. And I'm not trying to get around the decommissioning, but the health of the land throughout the project is something, again, that we take very seriously, as much as we see it as a part of what we were developed upon here as a company, because we want to return the land in the state we found it or better. And so we see a continuing process of caring for what has been happening on that land. So when it is time to say goodnight to the solar farm, we know what is there, we know the health of the land, we know what needs to be removed. Anyone want to else jump in there and give it from the local perspective?
Well, I'll just say that we had that question come up, and I thought I was prepared, but to talk about that at the meeting, but I wasn't. But we got into that quite quickly, and I think it goes back to asking those questions and answering those questions on the front end, and then the person or the company or even the landowner you deal with, if it's a lease, it provides some opportunities, but then it provides some problems at the termination. That landowner may be left with that, or if a bankruptcy, for instance, occurs and they just leave it and go with it. You've got a lot of different things, and maybe a fund, maybe a bond, maybe just getting it right to start with a company that you feel like is going to do exactly what they say. And so far, that's where we are. But we're working through those issues.
Work in progress, then that's the answer. Sometimes that's reasonable. I know we're running a little behind here, so I will go ahead and ask our final question to all of you, which is what advice or recommendations would you give to local officials, elected and planning commissioners as well, who are considering incorporating solar into their communities?
I'll kick it off. I would just say, engage early in the process and really get everybody at the table in the beginning to craft, from my perspective, and at least what I deal with in my legal practice, a zoning ordinance that's reflective of your community, that's fair to industry, and that also is protective of your citizens and their considerations with surrounding property owners and what they want their community to look like. It sounds like a heavy lift and a heavy order, but I've seen it done in multiple communities across the state. And so I think that really being proactive instead of reactive is the key to signing a successful solar project.
And I would add, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Gina. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to thank you, Kyle. I was just going to add on to what Madison said. Engaging early is so important, and having the conversations, asking the questions. There's a lot of misinformation out there right now about the industry. And I think it all goes back to what we talked about. Economic development at the end of the day means relationships and partnerships. And you want to know that the person on the other side of the table is someone that you can trust, and that someone you want to enter into this type of business relationship with. And to tag on more to what Madison said, with a well-developed ordinance that works for the community and the developer, it's advantageous for everyone. And I think that it gets a lot of the what ifs out of the way and really gets to the meat of what needs to be done and reap the benefits. All you, Kyle.
All right, I'll just chime in and agree with both what you and Madison said. One thing I would add is, if I'm in a small rural community, I'm on this call, I would pick up the phone and call Terry and Craig right now. Because if you're starting, from the 5-yard line, these guys are across midfield, and Terry's already scored a couple of touchdowns as Mayor Fitzhugh, but learn from each other and ask the right questions, build the right relationships. And, where the ag side of it comes in, work with folks like Lindsay and answer questions about agrivoltaics and how that works, because you may look at a piece of ag property and think, what, that's not going to work for a solar array, but there may be an opportunity. There are certain crops that can coexist on a solar project, but getting those questions answered before you start investing a whole lot of time and money because you're going to have questions that come from solar companies. And then on the front end, if you're able to answer those for yourself, it'll help inform the decision, which company do I want to work with? And I think, Gina would love to answer your questions too, I'm sure, because they've got experience all over the country.
I would say involve the local power company very quickly. I mean, we're key from the front end. You have to have a relationship with us because you're going to interconnect with us. And so that's for any community leaders, but other communities, a good point, Kyle, call us. We've got some projects online. We've stepped through landowners and we've learned a lot in the last 2 years. And we're willing to help out not just our community, but any other communities who are looking to get involved.
So building on what Kyle said about doing the work up front, I absolutely agree with that. There's reports that have looked at canceled or delayed renewable energy projects, and environmental concerns are often the largest source of opposition to projects that cause these cancellations and delays. So the more that local planners can do upfront to eliminate those concerns, to cite projects where those environmental concerns are not going to come up, is going to be one of the best ways to streamline projects to getting them finished. And that means using high resolution data, conservation data, land use and demographic data, looking at those maps and figuring out how that fits into planning processes.
Well, I would say that exactly what the other folks on this panel have said, and say this is going to be worth it. This is proven. It's clean. It's positive. It will have a good return for everybody involved. I sincerely believe that. And I think it's worth doing, but it's worth doing as much as you can on the front end to get it sent.
You all have been great to work with me and to work with everybody on this. This is a lot of folks on this Zoom call, and we do have a few Q&As that are coming in through the application here. And I'll just do these in order and see where we can get on this. The first one talks about commercial rooftops and sort of an untapped solar potential there. And is there any focus on that, or should it not be a focus, since that doesn't necessarily require a land use disturbance?
I can take that one. We have done rooftop solar before, but our focus is utility scale in order to get the maximum benefit. I think, again, I'm not an engineer. I don't know if I should have said that from the beginning, but I am not an engineer, so I don't want to completely misspeak here, but I don't think that the benefits necessarily from capturing the amount of energy that needs to be captured is there from a rooftop component. So that is where, when we partner with utilities, we are trying to maximize energy production. But I think that this is what's going to be fun about this industry moving forward, as people develop more ways to be creative in the way that we arrange solar and the way we produce it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it works differently in different parts of the country. I think that's something else we need to take into effect.
Okay, thanks for that. There are other questions about just the challenges, and I know we've hit on this a little bit through the way, and maybe just the distinction between the challenges of, say, West Tennessee and East Tennessee, or something to that effect, in terms of the community perspective and the community buy-in for solar.
Kim, I'll jump in on that, and I'll also circle back to, I think the next question too, is that, one of the biggest challenges is the uncertainty of decommissioning. Gina talked about it, Craig talked about it. Tennessee, and it was 2 legislative sessions ago, and I apologize that I don't know the public chapter off the top of my head. I can tell you that Paige Wally carried the bill in the Senate, enacted a decommissioning legislation that really put the onus on private property owners, and the agreements put legal requirements that have to be in an agreement between a landowner and a solar company that's leasing the property. That requires the solar company to put up decommissioning requirements. There's a whole long list of what can be acceptable, but it's really left to the negotiation of what the landowner wants and also what the solar company. It's, kind of a hands-off business approach. A decommissioning plan also has to be provided. As Gina said, that plan is also oftentimes being shared with local communities so that they're aware of what's going on in this private business transaction. But that really has been put a lot of solar companies at ease, as well as local communities, to know that it has to be happening. If it's not, it gives a private right of action to a landowner to kind of go after or to recoup that decommissioning obligation from a solar company. But I think that that is really important. And if communities are looking at crafting solar zoning ordinances, I think reading that bill and talking to someone who maybe has implemented it in their community would be helpful.
Thank you for that. There's a series of questions here, but I'm going to jump around a little bit on this and go to the county question first regarding county property tax. The question might be how exactly an economic development project might bring in more revenue, and if the assessment of that property might be greater than the assessment of non-developed land, I'm assuming it would be, and so would they be treated as commercial property and sort of assessed in that particular manner?
Yeah, I'm not a tax expert, so I'm going to rely on Madison to answer that because I know she can do that very succinct, but she's saying no on that one too. My answer to that question though is every project is different. Every site is different. And the biggest consideration is what is highest and best use of that property. I go back to, I mean, we are not about to put a large solar installation inside one of our industrial parks. Now, does that mean there might not be solar arrays there that support an existing industry or something smaller? It doesn't mean that, but it all goes back to the highest and best use of that property, because even if you do improve the value of that property from or start generating more taxes because you have the solar investment, it doesn't mean that you maximize the value of that, because where you're putting a solar array, it could have been a piece of property that could be better developed for residential or for industrial space.
Right. What would be the smallest or maybe even the average size of one of these projects? You know, are you looking at 40 acres or 5 acres or 200 acres?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. Rule of thumb, 10 acres for every megawatt of generation. So that's a rule of thumb. So we have a 7 megawatt installation sitting on 80 acres. So there's a little to spare there. The larger installation that is being discussed right now, I mentioned that just under 600 acre piece, that's going to be a 50 megawatt. So roughly 10 acres per megawatt of solar. I think that will improve over time as the technology improves, but that's kind of the rule of thumb about where the technology stands today.
A question too about where counties or local governments might look for grants or assistance in getting solar projects underway.
I'll start with that. I'm sure Craig and Terry can chime in a little bit. I would, working with Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, they're looking with your development districts within your region to see what opportunities may be out there. Because again, just like looking at different pieces of property, there's not one grant that's going to be something that would apply to everyone.
And another question on from the environmental or ecological perspective, if say it's a shrub land due to logging perhaps or disturbance, I guess the question is, if you bulldoze and make room for solar panels, is that a reasonable swap? Or would it be a better use to say, I mean, if you're going from scrubland to solar panels versus hardwoods to solar panels?
I guess I'll take that one and caveat it with I am not a forester, and so I don't know too much about the ecological priority of a shrub pine ecosystem, but I will say that just in terms of making that decision, in terms of, should we be putting solar on a hardwood forest? Should we be putting it on a recently disturbed logged piece of property? I think it's a matter of looking at the bigger conservation picture and seeing how does this area map to what has already been identified as high or very high conservation priority areas. Is it next to another forest that has an intact undisturbed forest, which would be the highest priority for conservation? And so it's really looking at where does it fit into the ecosystem, the larger habitat corridor, and then also looking at what species are present there. What species do we need to be worried? Are there species of concern? So I think it's looking at it as a more holistic picture, but certainly avoiding any natural forest would be of highest conservation priority.
Do you think your organization, Lindsay, would be capable of generating solar potential maps for a given county or community from the perspective of these environmental considerations? I know they can do it from the perspective of to the grid or, things of that nature, but from the perspective of better, highest, best use from a environmental standpoint.
Absolutely. Well, so we have very talented GIS mapping folks who can take that sort of data and layer it. We have maps that we've created both for within the Conservancy and also in partnership with TWRA around those conservation priority areas. I know Tasser is doing a solar study right now, and they were interested in potentially layering some of this conservation maps with solar type maps. To my understanding, I'm not familiar with existing solar data out there on being able to identify what lands would be most suitable for solar, but there isn't any technological reason why, if that data was available, we couldn't do that sort of collaboration to overlay it with conservation priorities. If anyone's interested in doing that, please get my contact information and follow up.
And I would also add that as a solar developer, we are regulated to a degree to avoid environmental impacts, historical markers, other functions on the site that would not be conducive to having solar panels on top of them for whatever the reason, understanding the setbacks needed. Lindsay mentioned wildlife corridors earlier. We always use wildlife fencing. We have relocated bat habitats before and a tortoise habitat for sure. And so I think that there is some of this that's already in place, but the land needed for a solar development really goes down to being relatively flat, relatively water-free, and being in close proximity to where we can interconnect. So that does leave, so we get that question a lot of why this land? And those are the main drivers for us. Now, obviously, every project is different, as Kyle alluded to earlier, and that's when we work with the communities to understand what their comprehensive plan is, what they're looking for, what their drivers for other economic development projects are like, to see what, if it is a good fit for solar long-term in that community.
Gina, I would add that, and I know Terry can expand upon this. It sure would be worth your while. Let's just take, for example, you're in a community and you have not developed any parcels for a solar project. Work with your utility and use GIS to determine what spots in your community are the best fit. So that way, when someone calls on you and it's like, hey, we're interested in so-and-so county and I think we'd like to develop a solar project here, you're going to vet that company. But you really don't need to waste any time on looking at pieces of property that your utility could tell you pretty quick is not going to work.
Right. Okay, I think we're close to winding down, and I have a whole set of other questions that we could ask, but given the
Kim,
time,
I think let's go for about 5 more minutes. You can finish out the questions from Joe and maybe ask one additional question.
Okay, can you help me point me to which one is still missing here from?
Oh, I think it was to Mayor Fitzhugh.
Okay, all right, thank you. So Mayor, the question was, without solar, you had a comment about not making the cut, and you did you mean for federal funding to a county or city, or also to state funding?
Well, actually, what I meant was, in my particular area, making the cut now, it's going to be an industry coming your way with the advent of, especially for us. So that the funding would be the ability to get those jobs and help by that. That's that arrow in the quiver type thing that Kyle was talking about, and that's what I meant by that. Now there may be some funding out there, but with the revenue involved with one of these, that it's not maybe not as necessary as in some other projects. But that's what I had in mind on that.
So you're wanting to look solar friendly, more or less, by having done your homework rather than and not getting discarded in the.
That's correct. That's exactly right. More than look, be actually solar friendly, but yes.
Of course. All right. So another question in the chat. Tennessee is having a run of successes and new and expanded economic nodes. What are TNECD and its sub-states regional partners doing to disseminate the lessons learned to all communities statewide? I know today's event and the annual Governor's Conference are part of this, but are there new lessons learned initiatives afoot? I'm particularly interested in how these lessons might advance the 2,000-acre site in Coffee County near Tullahoma.
What is the specific question? Let's see. What are lessons learned? Milt, are you still on? Could you type in some more information of what you're looking for here?
This is maybe directed at the ECD.
I will say that just as a quick note, just as distinguishing actually solar development as projects versus solar development as an attraction mechanism for other companies. An ECD at the state level, their economic incentives are really driven by jobs and job creation. And so they don't necessarily, while they understand and are entirely supportive of solar companies, as all these companies that are, Blue Oval City is a great example of recruiting these high employment companies to areas. These companies are looking for renewable energy. ECD is not incentivizing Silicon Ranch to receive a grant from ECD because all of their grant programs, at least to the best of my knowledge, are really based in job creation.
Yeah, and Milt, I see you've thanks for considering the question, kind of backing up on that. I think an easy answer to that is each region of the state, Tennessee Department of Economic Development has consultants. And then you jumping on this call, you're building relationships with people. So it all goes back to just asking the right questions. And as Madison said, you may not see ECD pushing a whole lot of information out other than, you need to be able to answer questions about renewable energy because that's really not their role. They're not recruiting solar companies, but the answers are out there. And I would just, you've jumped on this call, but you've probably got people who've got some other questions. Just point them in the right direction on some of the experts on this call, and ECD and folks like Courtney who just popped back on can answer those questions for you.
And I want to say one more thing about ECD. While they may not be recruiting the actual solar facility and farms, they might be recruiting the manufacturing of solar panels and other components that might be creating the jobs that get to those counts for incentives given by the state or TBA. So it's all part of the supply chain is my point.
And it also sounds like the toolkits and best practices, all of that sort of publicly available or at least available information is very helpful to communities trying to work their way through this.
And I just want to say, if there are any questions that were not answered today or something else comes up, I'm happy to respond to anyone that's attended. And if I don't have the answer, I'll find it for you.
I think we did have a question about the panelists, information on the panelists in terms of emails or contact information.
Yes, we will. The Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council will send up a wrap-up email that includes a recording of this webinar. And if it's okay with all of our panelists, which I think it is, we'll also send contact information as well. So everybody who registered for this webinar will receive a recording and contact information for all of our panelists.
So I think, is this the wrap-up time, Courtney? Excuse me for being bad.
Yes,
bad
yes,
moderator.
we can wrap up. We can wrap up.
All right. And I have learned a tremendous amount today, and I appreciate all of you and your time spent helping answer questions and helping us all learn a little bit more about this emerging area that will definitely have impact in Tennessee in the years and decades to come. I do think that we all need to be listening in and paying attention to this and helping to shape how the renewable energy portfolio gets expanded in Tennessee, especially the solar component. So thank you for asking me to moderate, and thank you all for being panelists. And with that, I think I'll pass this over to Courtney for any final words.
All right, just thank you everyone very much. You'll receive a wrap-up email from us, and you can visit our website, tnadvancedenergy.com, if you'd like to learn more. Thank you all. This concludes the webinar.